July 20th, 1969. Star City, USSR. The corridor hums with fluorescent light. It's past midnight in Star City, but no one is sleeping. Radios crackle in tangled knots of static. Antennas strain skyward on chilly rooftops. In a darkened office, two men lean over a receiver, heads bowed, not in prayer, but in disbelief. The voice is unmistakable. Calm, American, controlled beneath the static. Houston, Tranquility Base here. Silence follows, suspended like cold breath in winter air. One of the men, a decorated cosmonaut, tightens his jaw. His hands rest not on mission controls, but on the edge of a metal desk, white-knuckled. A colleague says nothing. He doesn't need to. Across the ocean, a Saturn V has delivered its payload to destiny. Mankind has landed on another world. But here, behind the steel doors and red drapes of the Soviet space program, men of legends are quiet, for the first time in years, and in that silence lies the weight of a decade and the shiver of something else. The moment they knew, they had lost the moon. The story of Soviet reaction to Apollo 11 doesn't begin in 1969. It begins in triumph, 12 years earlier, October the 4th, 1957. Sputnik 1, a polished metal sphere no larger than a beach ball, soared into orbit above the Earth. It was a heartbeat in the heavens, a pulsar of panic for the West, the world's first artificial satellite, launched not by American engineers but by the Soviet Union. This was not just a technological achievement, it was a political announcement. The USSR, still recovering from the ravages of World War II, had outpaced its wealthier, more industrialized rival in reaching the final frontier. A domain once imagined for comic books and philosophers had just become a stage for Cold War rivalry. The United States didn't just lose a space race that day, they lost their global aura of technological supremacy. And the Soviets knew it. 3 years later, they struck again. April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome aboard Vostok 1, becoming the first human to orbit the Earth. The smiling son of a carpenter returned to Moscow a hero of mankind. Statues would rise, school children would chant his name. Premier Nikita Khrushchev would ride that euphoria to cement the USSR's image as the undisputed leader of space. Inside the Kremlin, a belief solidified. Space was the future. Political, strategic, and symbolic. And the Soviets owned it. But if the glory flowed freely in public, pressure was mounting in private. By the mid-1960s, the Americans were awakening. NASA, which had trailed desperately throughout the early years of the space race, now turned to a new goal, not just to orbit, but to land. The Apollo program, initiated under Eisenhower and accelerated under Kennedy, marked a radical escalation. No longer content with matching Soviet orbits, the Americans were now building a vessel to reach the moon and return. In public, the Soviets projected confidence. Behind closed doors, however, the Politburo was nervous. Sergei Korolev, the chief architect of Soviet rocketry and the mastermind behind Sputnik and Gagarin's flight, attempted to convince Moscow to go all in on a lunar strategy. But the bureaucracy, fractured, political and inflexible, refused to immediately pivot to a singular, coordinated moon effort. Instead, the Soviet space program fractured across institutions. One team worked on lunar probes, another on the Soyuz spacecraft, and a third struggled to develop the heavy-lift N-1 rocket, a Soviet counterpart to NASA's Saturn V. There was no unified Apollo-style directive, only overlapping fiefdoms and national pride animating a desperate game of catch-up. After Korolev's unexpected death in 1966, following surgery, the sense of urgency curdled into disarray. By 1967, the cracks could no longer be hidden. The Soviets suffered a major blow. Soyuz 1, carrying cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, crashed on re-entry after a faulty parachute deployment. Komarov died in fiery wreckage. The man had known his mission was doomed, and he went anyway, because he knew if he refused, his friend Yuri Gagarin would be sent instead. Moscow called it a patriotic tragedy. The engineers called it something worse, a symptom. The Americans were facing setbacks too. The Apollo 1 fire in January 1967 killed 3 astronauts on the launch pad, but the difference wasn't in the cause, it was in the aftermath. NASA restructured. Its systems were overhauled, its timeline pushed back, but not broken. The Soviet program, in contrast, shuffled quietly onward. Test flights were scaled back for propaganda secrecy. Failures were buried in bureaucratic reports. The highly ambitious N-1 rocket project, the core of any credible moonshot, was stalling. Each launch attempt ended in catastrophe. In Ryazan, in Moscow, in Baikonur, veteran cosmonauts, rocket engineers, and commanders in grim caps began to suspect the unthinkable. They were losing the race. And worse, they might not even have had a real chance at winning it. By 1968, the world was inching closer to one of the most profound spectacles in human history. But only one superpower still believed they could get there first. For America, the moon had become more than a mission. It was destiny backed by dollars and watched by the world. The Apollo program, once seen as a bold gamble, now gained an aura of inevitability. In December 1968, Apollo 8 achieved the first human orbit of the moon. The images, Earth rising majestically above the grey horizon, stunned the globe. The American flag had not yet touched lunar soil, but in the court of public perception, the jury had seen enough. Momentum had shifted irrevocably, and the Soviets knew it. Inside the USSR, the national press barely mentioned Apollo. Where they could, they denied. Where they could not, they deflected. Yet, behind closed doors, within the walls of the Central Committee and the hushed corridors of Baikonur Cosmodrome, tension mounted. Engineering documents were falling behind schedule. The N-1 rocket, massive and unproven, had already failed in static tests. Each component, engines, tanks, guidance systems, seemed more fragile under pressure. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans launched Apollo 10, a dress rehearsal for the moon landing. It orbited, descended to within 15 kilometers of the surface, and returned without touching soil. It was the final domino before the leap. The USSR had no equivalent. Still, the Soviets weren't finished. Not yet. In a last-minute countermove, subtle, shrewd, and desperate, the Luna 15 spacecraft was launched on July 13, 1969, mere days before Apollo 11. Its mission was audacious: land on the moon, collect samples, and return them to Earth before the Americans could bring back human-collected lunar rocks. If successful, Moscow would broadcast it as a scientific triumph, even if the phrase "first man on the moon" would belong to Washington. It was not a race to walk. It was now a race to return. At Baikonur, tension radiated through the control rooms. Soviet tracking stations followed Apollo 11 closely, their sophisticated radar and signal intelligence arrays locked onto the spacecraft as it arced toward the moon. Soviet cosmonauts and engineers were ordered to monitor the American mission in silence. That silence was deafening. Some pretended to ignore it, or intercepting VHF signals from NASA's tracking downlinks. American news networks like Voice of America were scrambled, but not perfectly. The truth came through in waves. They heard the launch, they tracked the transit, they calculated the speed and trajectory, and by the night of July the 20th, 1969, they knew what was about to happen. Hundreds of kilometers above the Earth, Apollo 11's lunar module Eagle separated from the command module. Across Soviet listening posts, in Crimea, in Almaty, in East Germany, they listened. Inside Star City, cosmonauts off duty gathered around radios in communal kitchens and research offices. Some were quiet, others muttered curses. And they did. At 2017 UTC, the unmistakable voice of Neil Armstrong echoed through static and distance. Houston, Tranquility Base here. A pause, then a metallic breath of confirmation from Mission Control. It was done. A manned craft from Earth now rested on the lunar surface. At that moment, across the Soviet Union, the response was controlled and conflicted. No article ran on the front page of Pravda. No bulletin interrupted Soviet television. The event had achieved true enormity. And so it had to be made silent. But silence couldn't mute the truth. In Star City, some cosmonauts, seasoned pilots like Alexei Leonov and Pavel Popovich, reportedly acknowledged the achievement with a mix of awe and regret. The rivalry was real, but so was professional respect. They understood what it took. The Delta V margins, the fuel windows, the courage to land that machine in manual override with fuel to spare, measured in mere seconds. They didn't hate the men who went. They were stunned by the nation that pulled it off. Meanwhile, Luna 15, the Soviets' last-minute robotic counter, was still circling overhead. It would attempt its landing in 36 hours. It would fail. They were national heroes. They had orbited the Earth when no one else dared. Men like Alexei Leonov, Valentina Tereshkova, Pavel Belyaev, and Andrei Nikolaev had become living symbols of Soviet excellence in the 1960s. Street murals were painted in their honor. Schools bore their names. They were astronauts, yes, but also weapons in a war of ideology. And yet, none of them would walk on the moon. In the days leading up to Apollo 11's landing, many of them gathered informally at Star City, the training center near Moscow. There was no official viewing party. There was no broadcast ceremony like in the United States. They listened secretly through scrambled signals, Western radio channels, bootleg audio relays that buzzed through static like whispers in the cold. The silence in those rooms spoke louder than any speech ever could. Later, Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space, would recall the night as surreal. "We could follow their telemetry," he said. "We saw the signal drop, then resume from the moon's surface. And we knew." There was no celebration, no condemnation, just quiet calculation of all the missions they had flown and how far they had fallen behind. Inside the Soviet rocketry bureaus, the mood was different, less emotional, more analytical, yet more bitter. Many of these men had worked under the legendary Sergei Korolev until his untimely death in 1966. They'd inherited a lunar dream stitched together with pressure, secrecy, and broken promises. But they had never been given the tools. The American Saturn V had performed nearly flawlessly. A skyscraper of precision, power, and software coordination. Meanwhile, the Soviet counterpart, the N-1 rocket, had failed twice by 1969. Disintegrating engines, violent roll and instability. One launch in February had obliterated its launch pad in a fireball of 2,000 tons of thrust gone wrong. Watching Apollo 11 succeed was not merely professional disappointment, it was existential failure. As Neil Armstrong descended the lunar ladder, Soviet engineers ran calculations. They reviewed their insulation reports. They checked their vibration-tolerant specs against those needed for the lunar module descent. Quietly, they realized no Soviet design had even reached that level of maturity. One engineer reportedly muttered, "We're not 10 months behind." Politically, the reaction inside the Kremlin was not confusion, it was calculation. The Soviet response to Apollo 11 was silence, a silence crafted with precision, no front-page stories, no headlines. But that silence carried weight. Across the Soviet Union, rumors began to circulate. Students at Moscow State University discussed it behind dormitory doors. Teachers whispered about it without official curriculum mention. In Leningrad and Kiev, families pulled out old radios to catch foreign announcements on BBC or Radio Free Europe, scrubbing through static under bedsheets to avoid detection. The Kremlin's silence had done the opposite of control. It had confirmed the loss. The moon belonged to no nation. But the symbolism, the initiative, the triumph, the global cameras belonged to America, and the Soviet leadership, for all its machinery and might, could offer nothing to counter it. Not yet. For decades, the Soviet media apparatus had been a master of narrative. It didn't merely report events, it sculpted them into pillars of ideological truth. But by July 1969, the Ministry of Information had encountered an event too big to spin. The first steps on the moon were televised in over 30 countries. The Soviet Union was not one of them. In bold print, Soviet dailies like Pravda buried the story on page 3, beneath routine factory production updates. No names, no quotes, no triumph. This odd restraint wasn't just censorship, it was damage control. Soviet citizens weren't naive. Many followed the story through international radio signals. Some hotels in Moscow had foreign satellite feeds. Border republics accessed Polish and Finnish news channels. The truth seeped in. The propaganda machine didn't implode. It hesitated. Apollo 11 had shifted the rules of engagement. The Soviets no longer shaped narratives. They were reacting. And that subtle inversion of control, more than any map line, marked a new kind of defeat. The space race had never been just about science. It was about pride, prestige, and projection. For nearly a decade, the Soviet people had been told they were ahead, and in many ways they had been. First satellite, first animal, first man, first woman, first spacewalk, milestone after milestone. Everyone a knock on the West door, but suddenly that cycle broke. The next, that was always Soviet, had now become American. The moon was remote, yes, but the emotion it stirred landed in every home. In schoolyards across Lithuania and Turkmenistan, children asked why America had gone to the moon first. In Kazakhstan, where the Baikonur Cosmodrome stood like an altar to the stars, families wondered why the launches had stopped. In Moscow, engineers riding subways noticed the difference. Suddenly, no one asked about space anymore. The weight was invisible, but heavy, as if a collective breath had been held and never released. This wasn't the end of Soviet spaceflight, but it was the collapse of Soviet inevitability. Around the world, the moon landing became an ideological earthquake. In newly independent nations across Africa and Asia, where both superpowers were vying for influence through aid, arms, and ideology, Apollo 11 reset the scoreboard. Images of American astronauts planting the flag spread through newspapers from Nigeria to Indonesia. Western-aligned nations held press celebrations and film viewings. Even non-aligned states took notice. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. If America could land a man on the moon, what couldn't it do on Earth? For the Soviet Union, the loss of symbolic ground was immediate. Technological authority wasn't just about rockets. It meant economic promise, military reliability, and political alignment. Science had always been woven into diplomacy. In the post-Apollo world, America's stature had grown, and the USSR, though still formidable, had to reframe its identity. By December 1969, the Soviet Union had made a decision, one that reflected not surrender, but realignment. The moon race had been lost, but space was not. Soviet leadership, now under Leonid Brezhnev, ordered shifts in development funding. Crewed lunar efforts, including the N-1 rocket program, were quickly slowed, then shelved. Resources were diverted toward low Earth orbit dominance, an area still rich with strategic potential. The USSR refocused on space stations, long-duration human presence, and military reconnaissance satellites. The Salyut program was born. Its spiritual successors would evolve into Mir, and later, Russian contributions to the International Space Station. In private, some engineers still mourned the loss of the moon, but in official briefings, the conversation had changed. Control not of the moon, but of near space, the useful orbit. Where America reached for glory, the USSR reached for position. And that, too, was a kind of victory. If not poetic, then practical. July 20th, 1969. Baikonur Cosmodrome. The moon hung low in the Kazakh sky, a silent sentinel over a nation rooted in ambition. At ground level, however, the mood was conflicted. Engineers gathered not to launch, but to listen. The Soviets were not off the field. Not entirely. Luna 15, their robotic lander, was still in orbit around the moon. It had launched just 3 days earlier, without press, without spectacle. Its mission? Perform a soft landing, scoop up lunar soil, and bring it home before the Americans could return with their man-collected samples. This was Moscow's card. A space victory through technicality. If they couldn't plant the red flag on the moon, maybe they could beat Washington to bringing the moon back to Earth. For now, though, all Soviet eyes were on the Americans. Soviet observatories across Central Asia and Crimea were assigned to track Apollo 11's telemetry. The Americans, ironically, were easy to follow. Their radio transmissions were wide and strong, their telemetry open, their data clear. The Soviets didn't have to break through secrecy. NASA had made Apollo a global broadcast. In bunkers and mobile radar stations, Soviet specialists listened with headphones pressed to ears. They heard Buzz Aldrin calling out velocity corrections. They heard Armstrong's calm voice adjusting descent vector logic. They noted when the computer alarms fired. They calculated remaining fuel based on second-by-second profiling. At 2:17 a.m. Moscow time, the words came through the static. "Houston, Tranquility Base here." The silence inside Soviet listening stations shifted into something hollow. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of confirmation. The moon had chosen its first visitor, and it wasn't from Baikonur. There were no outward reactions, no flags lowered, no television addresses. Most of the USSR's citizens hadn't even been told what was at stake. But in intelligence centers and orbital labs, the mood was unmistakable. The Americans had done it. Done what Korolev had dreamed of. Done what the N-1 had failed to deliver. Done it live, deliberately, and without apology. In Star City, cosmonauts gathered in unofficial viewing rooms. Some had access to shortwave radio arrays aligned with Voice of America or BBC World Service. While the broadcasts were jammed in major cities, they slipped through in more peripheral zones. Some tuned in from as far north as Kaliningrad. Others listened through bounced signal relays. They didn't cry. They didn't rant. They just listened. Alexei Leonov would later describe the night with an almost poetic reverence. We knew what it meant. It was the first moment when many of them realized they might never walk on the moon. That history, their generation's greatest chapter, would already be written without them. Thousands of kilometers away, in the Kremlin, a different kind of silence closed in. There had been no applause, no hammers on the desk, no explosive outbursts. Just a room of stony faces watching a victory they hadn't prevented. Leonid Brezhnev received a report of the landing. He digested it coldly. There was no opportunity for response, only containment. A small statement was prepared for Pravda. No names, no images, no celebration. The moon was theirs now. But the Soviet silence would be its own kind of punctuation. The next morning, Luna 15 would begin its own descent. Moscow still clung to the hope that a sample return mission, however unmanned, would offer something symbolic. Perhaps not a moonwalk, but at least a moon grab. It was a risky maneuver. As the Americans set up flags, cameras, and scientific tools on Tranquility Base, Soviet technicians adjusted descent trajectory for Luna 15. The mission had trouble. Unusual orbits, degraded signal windows, inconsistency in telemetry. At 15:51 Moscow time, July 21st, Luna 15 slammed into a lunar mountainside, traveling at nearly 480 km/h. It was over. And so, in the span of 36 hours, the Americans walked the moon, and the Soviets tried and failed to answer. Inside Baikonur, engineers sat motionless over extinguished monitors. In Moscow, the news trickled in not as a front-page splash, but as a whispered defeat. No official admitted it, no agency dissected it, but every man involved knew what it meant. The moon was no longer an ambition. It was a wound, a crater widened not by impact, but by timing, by momentum, by misalignment. And now, Soviet boots would not be the first to touch its dust. As the Apollo 11 astronauts re-entered their lunar module, preparing for ascent, the moon was glowing, no longer as a mystery, but a memory. Meanwhile, back on Earth, in control rooms scattered from Baikonur to Moscow, stunned silence hung in the air. Radios were switched off, dials spun back to local frequencies. Engineers sat back in chairs that suddenly felt too large. The smell of warm circuitry faded. Typewriters fell still. No one clapped, no one spoke. Most simply stared. They had listened, calculated, traced simulations and vectors. But now the moment was real. The gap was no longer theoretical. It was historical. Cosmonauts who had flown above Earth suddenly felt grounded. For men like German Titov, Pavel Popovich, and Viktor Gorbatko, the reality took root quickly and quietly. These were men who had orbited the Earth before most Americans understood kilograms from thrust vectors. Now some sat in wooded dashers, others in government offices, wondering how they had gone from leading legends to historical footnotes. The foreign press speculated on Soviet reactions. But the truth was more complex. Internally there was respect, even awe. Cosmonauts understood what a moon landing demanded: deceleration burns, low S windows, precise flameouts with just seconds of fuel, all perfectly executed, under pressure in real time. Their emotion was not only geopolitical, it was professional. These weren't just the Americans, these were astronauts. And even from behind the Iron Curtain, a few Soviet pilots silently saluted the crew of Apollo 11. In the research institutes, the pain was different, technical, systemic, personal. A generation of Soviet engineers had built careers on blueprints aimed at the moon. For them, the sense of failure wasn't theoretical. It was etched into drawings on their desks, prototypes in their workshops, heat shields that would never scrape lunar regolith. The N-1 rocket, Soviet counterpart to the Saturn V, had been their silver bullet. Towering, ambitious, beautiful in concept, but overbuilt, undertested, and politically pressured into early launch. Its first two test flights had ended in disaster. One of them, Test 3L in February 1969, had created one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. In truth, many engineers already knew the answer before Apollo 11 touched down. They knew the summit was too high, the schedule too short, but they had hoped, anyway, that somehow Luna 15 might land, that Apollo might fail, that history might be rewritten by luck. But now, as Armstrong stepped back inside Eagle, they had nothing left to hope for. In government halls, the message was starker. Change course. Now. Apollo 11 had destroyed the one thing the Soviet space program had always depended on: perception. Previously, they could claim parity, or even leadership. They had Gagarin. They had Tereshkova. They had outer space itself. But now the moon belonged to someone else. And in matters of Cold War image, owning the moon was everything. By the end of July 1969, closed-door meetings across the Central Committee and Space Policy Councils shifted tone. Semi-official orders were made: slow funding to lunar programs, consolidate budgets, stop talking about future crewed lunar missions, at least publicly. Keep the Soyuz program alive. Focus on Earth orbit. Keep losses from the press. No public funeral was held for the Soviet moonshot, but those in the know could feel the burial happening in real time. Video footage of the Americans on the moon eventually made its way into Soviet film archives. Not officially broadcast, but copied, studied, filed. A few engineers at Cosmonauts were assigned to dissect the Apollo 11 NAV's data and LEM design. One said later in a debrief, it was like looking at another species. Efficient, brutal, over-resourced. They understood that beyond pride, beyond Cold War rhetoric, Apollo had pulled off something the USSR simply couldn't match, not without uniting fractured departments, aligning leadership, and doubling their already strained industrial capacity. For many, that was the final revelation. This wasn't just a space loss, it was a systems-level failure of ideology, bureaucracy, and hierarchy. Luna 15 remained a ghost. The robotic lander, launched days before Apollo 11 in a last-ditch show of Soviet capability, had crashed. Its signal vanished. Impact confirmed. No samples returned. In a poetic twist, its navigation path had been corrected so as not to interfere with the American landing zone. A quiet sign of respect from one superpower to the other. A technical achievement, but a symbolic surrender. And as Apollo 11 soared home across the sky above Moscow, its silhouette invisible behind classified airwaves, the Soviet Union turned inward. Slowly, reluctantly, resigned. The moon landing had widened a gap that Sputnik had once opened, and now, beneath Soviet soil, cosmonauts, engineers, and ministers alike had to confront a terrifying question. If they couldn't beat America here, could they beat them anywhere else? 8 July 1969, Moscow. The sun still rose, the trains still ran, and the rockets eventually flew. But something had shifted, not in space, but in tone. The moon was over, and within Soviet leadership and aerospace institutions, the conversation quickly and definitively changed. There was no mourning parade, no official explanation offered to the Soviet people for why no red flag had flown across Tranquility Base. There wasn't even a public acknowledgement that the USSR had intended to go. The moon landing, arguably the most watched event in modern history, was treated inside the Union as little more than a footnote. In truth, a great deal had died that week, but rather than holding a funeral for dreams lost, the system responded by erasing them. Behind closed doors, however, the reckoning had begun. By autumn of 1969, funding was drastically cut for the N1L3 lunar program. The rocket that was supposed to take a Soviet cosmonaut to the moon would continue for a few more test flights, but every person involved already knew the outcome. Translated, no more moon. In Baikonur, the N1 stood like a ghost of ambition, tested 4 times and 4 times failed, each test ending in combustion, collapse or misfire. The final attempt in 1972 scorched the night sky in particles of melted titanium and pride. And yet, out of those ashes came vision. The Soviet Union may have lost the moon, but it did not lose space. In fact, Soviet strategy coalesced around something America was neglecting: permanence, not performance. The USSR wouldn't go farther. It would stay longer. Enter Salyut. A series of orbital stations beginning in 1971 that aimed to master long-term human survival in low Earth orbit. These stations were factories, laboratories, observatories, a cosmic outpost that changed how the USSR viewed victory above the atmosphere. If they couldn't be the first to reach somewhere, they would be the first to remain. Salyut stations evolved. So did Soviet expertise. Cosmonauts routinely spent months, even a year, aboard them. The Mir space station, launched in 1986, would eventually become the most visited structure in Earth's orbit, hosting dozens of missions and crewed expeditions. Inside Soviet airspace, a new message was emerging. Let the Americans walk on the moon. Let them plant flags. That phrase, or versions of it, appeared in classified propaganda briefs circulated in the early 70s. The moon had been converted from a loss to a distraction, one that only America needed. Still, the psychological scar never fully healed. Ask any Soviet engineer who worked on the N1. Ask retired cosmonauts positioned to become lunar explorers. Ask the telemetry specialists who heard the signal fade from Tranquility Base at 21:11 Moscow time. A piece of them remained with that moment, not because they hated the Americans, but because somewhere deep down they believed they could have beaten them. Had Korolev lived? Had the N1 been funded earlier? Had bureaucracy bent just a little sooner? These were phrases whispered in safe rooms, not spoken in public, but history had already chosen. Publicly, the Soviet Union kept its steel face. When asked about Apollo 11 in educational broadcasts or youth space assemblies, party officials gave terse responses, a technical advance that confirms human progress in space. What they did not say, what they could never say, was this: we tried, we planned, we failed. And in that silence, truth lived in exile. By the mid-1970s, the dust had settled both on the moon and in Moscow. The Soviet space program was no longer chasing lunar illusions. It was perfecting orbital reality. But the wound remained. And in the quiet between missions, some cosmonauts and engineers allowed themselves to ask the forbidden questions. What would it have taken? What if we had landed first? These were thought experiments, not strategies. There would be no second chance. Not with the N1 rocket program cancelled in 1974 and its enormous blueprints locked away in classified archives for decades, but something remarkable began to take shape within that vacuum. A new doctrine of coexistence. For nearly 2 decades, the United States and Soviet Union had competed not only on ideological battlegrounds, but in orbits measured in meters and seconds. The Apollo 11 landing had widened that gap, but paradoxically, it had also defined the modern era of deterrence. Both sides had proven their technological command of the heavens. There was nothing left to prove, only something to protect. The first concrete gesture came in 1972, when a series of unprecedented diplomatic meetings led to a bold proposal: a joint orbital mission. Not rivals, partners. Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, 1975. In one of the most poetic reversals of the 20th century, 3 American astronauts boarded an Apollo spacecraft and launched into orbit. From the Baikonur Cosmodrome, 2 Soviet cosmonauts, including mission commander Alexei Leonov, once a lunar hopeful, launched aboard a Soyuz capsule. For the first time in human history, 2 nations who had battled each other for the moon physically docked together in space, sharing tools, air, and conversation. The image of the airlock hatch between the 2 spacecraft became iconic. In it, many saw not just the connection between 2 nations, but the closure of a story that began with Sputnik and climaxed with Armstrong's famous footstep. Leonov and his American counterparts exchanged symbolic gifts. They floated side by side, smiling not for propaganda, but for history. And yet, even in that moment of unity, one couldn't help but notice what was missing. No Soviet had yet stepped on the moon. Within the Soviet Union, the transition from moon dreams to orbital dominance matured. The Salyut series of space stations laid the groundwork for meaningful science in orbit. Experiments in long-duration spaceflight, zero-gravity biology, telescopic observation, and deep Earth mineral detection advanced rapidly. These orbital strongholds would give rise to Mir in the 1980s, the world's first modular, continuously inhabited space station, a triumph even America acknowledged as unrivaled. For cosmonauts like Valery Polyakov, who would spend 437 consecutive days in space aboard Mir, this was redemption. The moon had been emotional. Orbit was practical, and through that practicality, the Soviet space program built its second life. Ironically, it was low Earth orbit, not lunar soil, where the 2 superpowers would finally find lasting contact. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Soviet Union began folding in upon itself. Economic collapse, political unrest, the war in Afghanistan, a rising tide of glasnost and perestroika. The Cold War was cracking. But far above the chaos, Soviet cosmonauts still worked. Mir still orbited. Instruments still measured sun flares and protein crystallization. And American astronauts, now grounded in post-Apollo inertia, were looking upward again. The final convergence came after the USSR's collapse, but its components had been set in motion back on that summer night in 1969, when they had listened to the sound of a rival landing on the moon. From that moment, they had reimagined their purpose. In 2001, a former Soviet launch system carried components of the new International Space Station, a permanent orbiting habitat shared by former rivals. American shuttles docked with Russian modules. Cosmonauts and astronauts slept under the same metal roof, cooked with shared supplies, conducted research under the same microgravity conditions. The flags had changed, but the legacy of that moment, the missed moon, the crash of Luna 15, the silence of Baikonur, still echoed. Not in bitterness, but in perspective. The moon does not take sides. It circles above all borders, invisible to politics, immune to propaganda. And yet, for one silent summer night in 1969, it became the most contested space in human imagination. On its surface, boots touched dust. Flags were planted, words were spoken that echoed through a century. And yet, for millions of people living behind the Iron Curtain, that moment arrived without sound, without light, without permission to feel what the rest of the world was celebrating. The Soviet Union, the nation that had launched Sputnik first, sent Gagarin to orbit, and carried humanity beyond the sky, had lost the moon. Not because it lacked intelligence or bravery or ingenuity, but because its system could not evolve faster than its ambition. The cosmonauts did not fail. The engineers did not fail. The system protected itself before it protected possibility. And so, the moon remained untread by Soviet boots, not from lack of strength, but from a lack of unity. In the years that followed, space became a compromise, not a conquest. The USSR turned its gaze downward, toward Earth orbit, toward permanence, function, and survival. There, it reasserted its relevance, quietly and consistently, aboard the Salyut stations, Mir, and eventually the International Space Station. But the emotional wound never quite healed. The moon had been the summit. And that flag, visible in grainy black and white, was not red. Today, we look skyward not as adversaries, but as partners. ISS modules built in Moscow house astronauts from Houston. Japanese, Canadian, French, Iranian and Emirati flags float together in one spacecraft. We map the next journey. To Mars, perhaps, not behind walls, but over conference calls. Humanity has learned to collaborate. At least here, but we still owe something to that first race, to the silence that followed Apollo 11 and the hearts that endured it, because the legacy of the moon isn't just in who got there first, it's in who kept going after realizing they'd arrive second, or maybe not at all. It's in who took their crushed ingenuity and turned it skyward again, to finish a different kind of race. The Soviet Union never reached the moon, but it helped push us all toward it. Sometimes the gravity of an idea is enough.